So first of all, officially, we're welcoming you to our very first virtual Alumni 7 speaker talk of the series. We're doing a series of 7 talks, which makes sense since it's our 7 talks. They're going to be on Wednesday, starting tonight for the next 7 Wednesdays. And so, and we'll be sending out a reminder to everybody on Wednesday mornings. So you'll be able to join us for each of those. We're just so thrilled to start this series with Shilpi Somaya Gowda. We're so thrilled she's willing to spend some time with us and share her story and give us some tips and some advice about getting started as a writer. When we were thinking about doing this, we thought, you know, the stay-at-home time, while for many of us it's just as busy as ever, if not busier than ever, but for some, there's time that can be carved out to really start to put pen to paper or a keyboard to screen or however you'd like to do it. And we thought what a great time it would be to have one of our own to come in and give us some advice, somebody who's been through it, who's done this, and who now happens to be an international award-winning and best-selling author, which helps. So thank you, Shilpi, for being with us. I'll give you the floor, and what we'll do is hear from her, get her advice, and then we're going to open the floor for questions from everybody. So thanks, Shilpi.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks to all of you. This is actually such an amazing experience to see the faces of scholars and alumni across the country and maybe the world. We never get to gather in quite this way, so this is fun. Thanks for inviting me. I hope everyone is safe and well. I know that there's a lot of stress and anxiety during this time, but I've also heard from people that they're trying to use this different phase to maybe embark on something new, to tackle a project or to, you know, explore a creative side. And so I just thought I would share my story about how I came to be a writer, because it's a little bit unconventional, and give you some of my best tips, and then just have a discussion and answer questions. So my story is I started writing in 2006 after about 15 years of a business career. So when I was at Carolina, I was a econ major, and after graduation, I went to work in investment banking on Wall Street. And then I went to business school, got an MBA, and had a career in the business sector for about 15 years. And I would describe myself as being a very analytical and quantitative person. I really love looking at the world through the lens of economic models and math equations. That's sort of the way I make sense of things. But I had always also loved stories and storytelling. So I was an avid reader growing up. I always read novels. When we got the New York Times, I pounced on the book review section. I was always in at least 1 and sometimes 2 book clubs. So I seemed to just have an insatiable appetite for living in the world of stories. I wrote a little bit for myself. I kept a journal on and off throughout the years, and I would sometimes jot down things, you know, little ideas or scenes, but, you know, not really with any purpose in mind. So I'd really not had any formal study of English or writing since high school. So fast forward 15 years after graduation, I was living in San Francisco, had a great full life, and we decided to move, my husband and I and our 2-year-old daughter, from San Francisco to Dallas. I was not happy to leave behind a city and a life that was really full and rich. I had great friends, I had a great job. The one thing I did not have in my very full life was space to try something new. And after I moved to Dallas, I had, you know, a lot of space. So I decided to try to do something fun. I gave myself a year. I was about 6 months pregnant with my 2nd child. So I thought I would take the year and do something fun. And for me, that was playing. I really just wanted to play with the idea of writing. And I signed up to take some continuing ed classes at SMU at night. And I started the process of writing, and over about the next year and a half, I ended up writing a draft of what would become my first novel. And once I had once I had taken those classes, I put together a writer's group with some friends that I'd met in the classes, and we kind of kept each other, on track to keep writing. And when I finally had a manuscript that I thought was good enough, I used it to go out and find a literary agent. And then I worked with her for another year and a half or so to edit the novel until she thought it was ready for prime time. And then she ended up selling it to a publisher, HarperCollins, and it was published in 2010. And since then, I've written and published 2 more novels, but it's, even after 13 or 14 years, it's a little bit hard for me to believe that this is my career, having started out in a very different place. So I think that is all a way of saying that there's no one path to becoming a writer or probably any other creative field. I think that the experiences I collected in those first 35 years all went into how and what I wrote. So I'm gonna give you some of my best tips. Now I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, it's okay, hold on. This might take me a second, sorry.
While Shilpi is setting up her screen, I also wanted to say for Q&A, those who haven't done a whole lot of Zoom, which I can't believe is anyone anymore because we're all living on Zoom, there's a chat feature at the bottom. This will be for in a bit, but you can put a question in chat, or you can sort of raise your hand or just unmute yourself at the time. But we'll do that then. Sorry, Shilpi, didn't mean to jump in, but here you go.
That's okay. I'm having technical challenges. Even though I feel like I've been in a Zoom meeting constantly for the last 6 weeks, there's always something that confounds me. So here, I think, yeah. Okay, so this is a little statistic that I think is worth sharing. Only 25% of adults believe that they are creative. And I think that's wrong. I think 100% of adults are creative. It just takes a different manifestation. And, I think that there is a creative spark in every human being. So now I can't, now I'm trying to figure out, oh, there we go. The first question is, why do you want to write? And people want to write for different reasons, and your motivation or goal will probably drive what your end product is. So, there's not one way of doing things. Not everybody has to formally publish with a traditional publisher. If you are writing for self-expression, then you can keep a journal. If you want to share knowledge you've accumulated in your career, then maybe a short form essay published online is the best format. If you want to preserve a legacy for your family, for future generations, then maybe you want to self-publish a memoir. So that's the first question, I think, to ask yourself. The next step is what to write. And my advice is to identify what you most love to read and write that. Whether it's poetry, or if you love movies, maybe it's screenplays. Narrative nonfiction is a fancy way of saying telling a true story in the form of a novel, or short stories, or a particular genre of novel. And the reason I say to do this is I mistakenly thought when I wanted to start writing fiction that I should start with short stories because they're short and I could, warm up to the idea of a novel. Unfortunately, the short story class was full, so I signed up for the novel class. I did complete sets, and if I'd spent a couple years learning how to write short stories, I would have had to effectively start over when I wanted to start learning how to write a novel. So at some point when you have a lot of experience, you may be able to branch out. I've now toyed with the idea of writing a screenplay of one of my own novels because I've been asked many, many times. And the first several times I said no, because writing a screenplay again is an entirely different skill set, and I'm just figuring out, you know, how to write novels. So you will inherently have a knack for the thing that you love to read. I think that, you know, people will often ask me, how do you know how to do this? You know, if you've never taken, like, really studied it, or and I think I know how, you know, I know why a sentence sounds beautiful, or why a structure makes sense, or why a passage of dialogue sounds right, because I read hundreds and hundreds of books. And so I just have an intuitive sense for when something works. And that's why I think it makes, you know, the most sense to kind of write what you have spent time reading, because you will inherently be better at that. So how do you get started? There are a couple things you can do. One is to journal. And as I mentioned, this is something I've done on and off, and I really love it because it's just a way of getting the thoughts in your head down into words. And I've included a couple links here for tips on how to journal if you haven't done it before. They're particularly geared towards this time as well. I kind of think everyone should be journaling right now, because we are living through a chapter of history that we'll want to understand later, and documenting exactly what's happening to you and your loved ones now is one way of doing that. So even if you have no interest in, you know, writing for any other reason, I think it's a good thing to do right now. The other thing you can try is something called flash fiction, which is basically fast, off the top of your head, unedited writing, usually in response to a prompt. And there are hundreds of prompts you can find online. I listed one source here that I think has a lot of good ones, but you can also just find your own. When I was traveling for business by myself a lot, I would, you know, spend a lot of time in airports and restaurants, and, you know, I would just watch people. And I would get I would construct conversations in my head for the couple across the, you know, at the table across from me, or try to invent backstories for the people I saw on airplanes. So you can come up with your own prompts, and these are all just exercises to get you into the habit. Which brings me to my next tip, which is keep going. Writing, like anything else, is a muscle that you just have to build. So my favorite advice is ABCD, apply butt to chair daily. I think it's great to get into a daily writing habit, even if it's not for very long. When I first started writing, I could only really write for an hour and a half to 2 hours in the morning. Some of that was because I was waking up with, you know, small children at 7 a.m. and I would get up at 5:30 to write. And some of that was I just sort of ran out of steam and endurance. Now, you know, after many years of doing it, I can write for 4 to 6 hours, and that's a very full writing session for me. But I had to work up to that. You should also just kind of use whatever tools help you. For me, a spreadsheet was actually my best tool to get started. I know that sounds odd, but I mentioned I'm a quantitative person, and when I was about to start writing my first novel, I had done, I'd done all my research, I had an outline, I'd done all the preparation I could do without actually starting to write. And I was nervous about it because I had never written a full-length book before. You know, the longest thing I had written up to that point was a very dry 80-page econ thesis my senior year. And a friend of mine said to me, you know, a novel is 100,000 words. So if you start writing 1,000 words a day, you'll have a full draft in 3 months. And I immediately came up with a whole bunch of reasons why I could not possibly write 1,000 words a day. And then he said, okay, so write 500 words a day. You'll be done in 6 months, and you'll have something to start, you know, working with. And something about that equation just kind of clicked for me. It made sense. You know, 500 words is 2 double-spaced pages. I thought I could do that every day. And 6 months didn't seem, you know, too crazy, you know, to have a full draft of a novel. So the very next day, I sat down and made a spreadsheet and started, mapped all that out for myself, and that's how I kept myself on track until I got through my first draft. It was just one day at a time, 2 pages at a time. That may not work for you because your brain may not work that way. You might be a visual person and you want an idea board. And if you post that over your desk, that might inspire you. Or you might want an accountability partner that you check in with every week to make sure that you're, writing a certain number of pages. But whatever tool works for you is the one you should use. Okay, so these are some of my final tips, and they're kind of, again, unconventional. The first is to consult some resources, but not so many that you're overstructured. There are umpteen books on craft out there, and you can take master classes and listen to podcasts. And I think having some direction is helpful, but having too much really inhibits your freedom. So I used a book called The Hero's Journey, which sort of explains the underlying structure in almost all modern novels and movies. And it's kind of fun because once you read it and you understand the 12 steps of the hero's journey, you can't watch a film without going, oh, that's step 8. And there's the all is lost moment right before the climax. So it's kind of helpful because I found it helpful to understand the underlying structure of stories. But don't go too crazy on trying to get instruction. Also, if you're going to do research, like for a different geographic setting or a different profession, do some, but leave space for your imagination. I heard Ann Patchett, the author, once say that she didn't need to travel to Latin America to write her famous novel, Bel Canto. She just had to call a friend that lived there and ask for 3 details. And then she could let her imagination do the rest. And I am a strong believer in that. I tend to not write about anything in my immediate sort of life experience. And I think it's because it's just too close and it doesn't allow enough space for my imagination. And my last tip is don't be too quick to share your writing with other people. First, you have to become, a writer always has to become their first and best editor. So you have to learn to rework something on your own before you share it with someone. I think we often go to another party because we want affirmation or we want, cheerleading. And that is the role of your friends and family and your spouse and everybody who loves you, is to keep you going. But it's not really fair to them or to you to conflate that role with what you really need at a certain point, which is objective feedback. So my advice is to work on something for as long as you can and make it as good as you can until you can't make it any better. And then seek out true feedback from, someone who's knowledgeable. So, you can partner with other writers, form a writers group. That's what I did, or you could hire a freelance editor at the right point, which is what a lot of people do when they're, when they have a full manuscript, or you can develop a few trusted readers, which I've done now as well. So that's sort of my advice for when and how to share your work. So I'll leave you with one final thought, which is this quote from Elizabeth Gilbert: "Unused creativity is not benign." I said at the beginning that I think that all human beings have creative instincts in them. And if you're not channeling it in some way that's meaningful, then you're not fully living your life and you're not really giving to the world as fully as you can. So that's my last thought. And I think we can open it up to questions. Turn this on. Go.
Great. So
I have a question.
great.
Hi, Shilpi. I'm Leticia. I'm a sophomore scholar, actually now rising junior scholar. It's crazy. I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. I really love this. But my question is, if you could talk a bit more about like the business side of writing and, finding an agent. What was it like, selling your book and things like that?
Yeah, so I have a writer friend who says writing is an art and publishing is a business, and they only live uneasily together. I think that's probably true of most artistic pursuits. There are a lot of things that I don't love about the publishing industry. As a business person, it's very hard to participate in an industry that's not that well run, as on the sidelines, and not be able to fix it. I found an agent through the traditional route of finding an agent is to do something called querying. So you write a query letter, and it's a very specific format that you have to follow, 3 paragraphs. Each paragraph is supposed to say a particular thing. And the best way to find a list of potential agents is to look in the acknowledgments of the author's books that you love, that you think you're trying to emulate, and see who their agents are. Hopefully, if they have a good relationship, they've thanked their agent in their acknowledgments. If they haven't, that's a whole other problem. And you make your list, and I know people who query hundreds of agents. I think I ended up querying about 20, and some will get back to you and say, this is not for me. Some will get back and say, I'd like to read more. It's important to follow each agent's specific requests. Like they will say, I want 5 pages in a PDF format, not sent as an attachment, on this day, and you have to follow all of their rules. And then, if an agent reads more and is interested, then they'll make you an offer of representation. So I followed that route. I also happened to run into someone at a conference who introduced me to, actually, she didn't introduce me, she passed my pages on, unbeknownst to me, to a friend of hers who had just started business as an agent. And so I ended up having 2 or 3 people that were interested, and I kind of interviewed them. I mean, I didn't realize that's not really what authors do. They usually just, take the first offer they get. But I didn't know what I didn't know. I was coming from a world where you interview people and you check references. And so I did all that, and I ended up choosing an agent who, I've been with. I've had a really, long and happy partnership with for 15 years or so now. So that's the agent question. And then were you also curious about publishing, the publishing piece?
Yes.
Okay, so generally authors have to work through an agent. You can't just work directly with publishers. That's why I was explaining how, the process of getting an agent. And then that person navigates the other half of the transaction for you. So they have relationships with editors at various publishers, and they kind of know. They'll put together a list of people they think are a good fit, and then they'll do something called submission. So they'll send out a submission to various editors, and then they have a back and forth with them. And if you're lucky enough to have more than one interested, you might end up having an auction. Again, I ended up having a couple publishers interested in my first book, and I checked their references because I didn't know any better. That both of them were equivalent financial offers. So I was trying to decide, what, based on other measures. And I haven't worked outside. I've continued to work with the same agent and the same publishers since then. So I had to do it once, and I've been happy with those relationships.
Thank
May
you.
I ask a question, please? This is Chuck Ferguson. I sort of wrote my book backwards. The publisher came to my organization and asked us to write a how-to book, and so I did. And I didn't have an agent. And the publisher published the book, but it's never showed up in any stores. You can only buy it on Amazon. Is that do I need to go get an agent? Is that who talks to REI and Gander Mountain and Dick's to say, hey, put this book on your shelf?
Yeah, it sounds like you may have worked with either a hybrid publisher or a publishing house, because a traditional publisher usually won't work directly with authors. So, you know, there's a handful of traditional publishers, some small presses will, but generally it's a spectrum between, you know, self-publishing on one end and a very big, called the big five traditional publishers on the other end. And then there's a bunch of, you know, things that kind of fall somewhere in the middle. And the closer you get to the big five end, the more distribution you get. That is the main thing that publishers offer you. They offer you editorial support and, you know, jacket design and all the other things, but the main thing they offer you that you can't get without them is distribution into certain channels. So you can get into Amazon, you might be able to get into your local bookstore, you know, if you go in and have a conversation, but you won't be able to get into mass market retailers or the kind of specialty stores you're referring to, or, you know, independent bookstores widely without a traditional publisher.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're interested, Chuck, in doing that, you might want to just take a look at your contract and see when the rights revert to you, which they do usually at a certain point. If you know, if it's been out of print for a certain amount of time, or it hasn't reached a certain level of book sales within the past 12 months, you can request that the rights be reverted to you, and then you could start the process of finding an agent and publishing more traditionally.
Chuck, you're muted. You're muted. There you go.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you very much for that advice. I will pull my contract out and see. It's interesting. We wrote it to make money for the future for the national organization. So I get 0.9% royalty, and the national organization gets 13%. And so I think they would love for me to get it into the stores. But thank you very much. That's great advice.
Good luck.
Shilpi, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm Emil. I'm an incoming first-year scholar. In terms of reading what you love, what are some authors or types of books that you've drawn inspiration from?
Well, I read, especially before I started writing, I read a lot of South Asian authors. So Jhumpa Lahiri is one of my favorite authors. She's actually, I remember reading her first book of short stories when I was about 25. And for the very first time thinking, you mean people might want to read my stories? Which just goes to how important representation is, because I had been a very avid reader and I saw myself in all kinds of stories, but I never really thought about writing until I saw, you know, someone from my demographic profile publishing something. But I read really widely now, I think, because I interact with so many authors and publishers, so people will send me stuff to read and endorse, and so I think my reading tastes have gotten a little bit broader now. I still really love global, you know, sort of what's called global or multicultural stories. I also have a new budding interest in kind of fantastical, a little more like fantastical, dystopian, futuristic stuff. So or things that are structured really non-traditionally, like I just finished reading The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. She wrote a book a few years ago called Station 11. They're both a little bit dystopian. So those are a couple. I have a long list, but.
Okay, yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Shilpi. My name is Jared Pittman, and I'm an incoming scholar as well. I was just curious as to what you believe are some common traps that young aspiring writers fall into.
That is a great question. It's a very insightful question. You know, maybe it's just because of the path I've taken, but I feel like it's hard to write or maybe even create any kind of real art until you've lived some life. because if I had tried to write a novel when I was, 25 instead of 35, it would have been really different. And so, I think being in too much of a rush to get to your end goal, maybe one trap. I think when you're young, the opportunity you have is to really hone your craft. I mean, you can practice and practice and practice, writing a beautiful sentence or drawing a three-dimensional character or writing dialogue till it sounds, 100% realistic. So I think, investing in that when you're younger, like really the skill and the craft, you may not have the story yet, you may not have the story that's going to like impact people or have the type of effect you want it to, but you can work on the craft part of the equation.
Derek, did you have a question? And I appreciate the way everyone is introducing themselves when they come on. That's perfect. Thanks so much for doing that.
Yeah.
I did.
Thank you, Shilpi.
Hi, Shilpi. My name's Derek Bevel, class of 97, screenwriter who's written a first novel and going through the attempts to get it published now. And my specific question is about the query, which I have found is almost harder than writing the book itself.
Yeah.
You mentioned how formulaic that letter is, and any website you look at online, it basically says the same exact info. And I guess what I'm asking you is, how much do you, it may be on a gut level or practically, how much do you feel it's best to really follow those guidelines, look like a pro, versus doing something that's going to catch people's attention that may be cheeky or stand out from, the oodles of these kind of letters they get? Like, how much should you be yourself versus just follow the rules with this kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's possible to do both. And I think if to the extent you can do both, the more successful you'll be. So I think part of the reason the query letter is so formulaic is because it gives them a way of quickly filtering through things, the same way that like every single manuscript is supposed to be Times New Roman, 12-point, double-spaced, 1-inch margins, like no exceptions. It drives me crazy because I don't like Times New Roman. So I write in another font, and then at the last minute, I convert it over. But that's there to help them because they have a feel for what they should, how much the story should pick up by page 5, for example, or how they should feel by page 10. So if you're varying from that too much, you're messing with their filter. And the query letter, has those 3 paragraphs. I always thought the third one is very funny. For those of you who are interested, the first one is you introduce, your book in a nutshell, or, yourself. The second one is you introduce the synopsis of your book. And the third one is you're supposed to like talk about your accolades and publishing credits. So I only ever had 2 paragraphs. I had nothing to put in that third one. But I think that to the extent you can do that, but let your voice come through, the voice, if it's humor or satire or, whatever it is, if you can infuse your voice into all 12 sentences on that page, that's what they're looking for. So they want the filter and they also want to see the specific at once. Yeah. And one thing I found helpful, someone told me was, if you're trying to put yourself in the context of other books, you can say like, this book would sit very easily on a shelf next to A, B, and C, without saying, I'm going to be the next Jhumpa Lahiri, which is, a little presumptuous and off-putting. You can say, here's the kin I'm going for, and say it in that kind of way.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. That's exactly what I wanted. Was
Good
curious
luck.
about. Thank you. I'll keep you posted. I'm sure you'll hear about it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Hi, Shilpi. My name is Roy Flood, class of 86.
Hi.
A little more basic, and this would be for Derek or Chuck or any other authors that are on the line. What sort of basic tools does one start with in terms of word processing? Most of us have other careers and other jobs. How do we get something out there that we can go back quickly and edit and restart and retry and so on without pencil and paper, for instance?
Yeah, I use Word, and I use this little known power tool in it called the navigation pane. So there's a way of basically making, like, say, each of your chapters a heading. And then if you open your navigation pane, you'll see all the chapters down, the left side, and you can basically move them around and, code them and that kind of thing, color code them. I like to work in Word. Some novelist friends I know love a Word. Well, I guess I don't know if it's an app, or I think it's an app or software called Scrivener. My understanding is it's got a very big learning curve, and I have never wanted to take time away from writing to learn software to write. So, and Word works just fine for me. So I like Word. In the beginning, I would like start a new document for every chapter, and then I kind of marry them together at some point.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm a Cutnam Alexander class of 2006. And I'm kind of dabbling around in more of the nonfiction category, I guess. And one of the things that I keep sort of encountering is this emphasis on author platform. And to me, it feels a little bit like the chicken and the egg. Like, how do you have a platform without having published? And kind of going back to your point about the third paragraph. So I wonder if you have any reflection on that, like how necessary is it? How does one go about building that and all of that?
Yeah, it is a chicken and egg, and it's one of these things that, like, a publisher really wants you to have a platform, but in a sense, that's really their job, is to help you build a platform. So this is one of the things that drives me crazy about publishing. But I think it is quite important. I think that they don't really consider nonfiction writers without some platform. And the easiest way to build one is through social media. So, you can have a website or post a blog, or even only be on social media and have a lot of followers by doing whatever it is that you're trying to be known for. So, if it's political commentary, collecting a lot of social media followers. If it's, communicating technical information, it's, probably posting blogs and having people, reference them. The other way is by speaking, by doing sort of TED-like talks, or, shorter type things, and broadcasting them on YouTube and having people, again, what they're looking for is somebody to do their work. They're looking for a first cut. They want to know that you've been filtered, that some people like your voice, that some people find your information useful, so that they don't have to start from ground zero. It's frustrating, I can imagine. That's one of the reasons I'm glad I just make things up.
Thanks.
Shilpi, Mac Harrell has a question.
Okay. Is that in the chat?
Hi, Shilpi.
Oh.
My name is Mac Harrell. I'm a medical Morehead from 1979.
Wow.
Now retired, and I'm a songwriter. And our industry is a bit different from yours. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in how you navigated the interaction with the business side so easily, because there are many vultures in music. It would be unheard of for a songwriter to be working with the same publisher 15 years later. So I'm very interested in, number one, what were your criteria for selecting your agent? And I'm sure you came across as very together as you communicated that tonight. What did you, and your writing must have been gorgeous for them to take you right off the bat, and with no previous history. So tell us a little more about how you selected this person that you've been with for 15 years, and how many other people was she working with when you selected her?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'd gone to this conference and it was in New York City, and I was getting feedback on the first 15 pages of my novel from actual editors and agents in New York. That was the shtick. And someone read my pages and she said she loved them, but she only published nonfiction. So she, at lunch in front of me, handed the pages to her colleague who published fiction. And she said, "Oh, I'll read it on the subway." And apparently she read them on the subway and said, "This is really good. I'm going to refer, I'm going to pass these pages on to a friend of mine." And the friend had been an editor for 15 years and had just, like a year or two, maybe 2 years earlier, decided to become an agent. So she was probably in her mid 40s at the time, experienced but new as an agent, which was lucky for me because she was really on the hunt for new talent, and she kind of had to be, scrappy in finding it. So she found me, she hunted me down somehow through those pages. And then along with some other agents I ended up querying, she and I ended up having a more in-depth conversation. I asked every agent who offered representation to me what, for the names of 2 of their clients to call. And I remember calling one of them, of the woman I ended up working with, and he said, he was actually a music writer. He said, "There are gentleman agents and there are shark agents. Aisha is a gentleman agent." And that stuck with me. I didn't even know there were 2 kinds of agents. I didn't know, like I said, I didn't know what I didn't know, but I knew I wanted the gentleman if I was going to be in this business. And that has been borne out. I mean, she's, that's really her style. And she is ultimately focused on what's best for my career, which is not always aligned with what's, best for her commission. So she's proven that time and time again. And so I've, even though we've had our ups and downs and bumps, I've, long term, it's made sense for me to stay with her. And I have had a few more bumps with my publisher. So I originally sold the book to HarperCollins to one particular editor. I thought they did a great job publishing and marketing the book, but I did not love working with that editor. I felt like her taste and my taste overlapped just in that tiny little sliver that represented my first book. And everything else I wanted to do was going to be outside of her domain. So I strategized with my agent. We ended up taking a different tack for my second book, and we sold it in another country first. And then she came back and talked to the publisher in New York and said, "Shilpi really likes you. She's not crazy about this editor." And the publisher decided to present me with a few other options. I was sure I was just going to have to leave them, but they ended up finding a workaround, and I chose another editor at the same house, again by checking her references. And one of the other authors that worked with her, who's now a very good friend of mine, just gave her a rave review, and she had also come off a bad editor relationship. So the way she spoke about her being like a very clear communicator and no BS, and treating her authors like adults and not children, and all the things I was looking for, sold me. So I've been really fortunate. It's not been painless, but I've still been a lot more fortunate than other authors I know whose editors, regularly mistreat them, or they get, yanked around, or they leave their house and then their book is orphaned. There's a lot of upheaval in publishing. And so it's, I've had it, relatively stable experience, but it's, there's still a lot of things that disappoint me about it, which is, I can only imagine how bad it is for other authors if I feel that from time to time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for one more, if anybody has a final question.
I have one more, if it's all right. I was just curious, Shilpi, what are some other hobbies or activities that you do that you feel like keep your creativity fresh? Like, what are the things you do to help you not to get burned out sometimes?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think really anything creative, even or especially if I'm not good at it. So, you know, I've taken up painting, which I'm a terrible visual artist. I've always played piano my whole life. So I often find if I'm stuck, like I will write in the room that my piano's in. And when I get stuck, I'll walk over to the piano, play a little something, you know, for 20 minutes. And then you know, it unsticks me. So anything creative like that, cooking, and like sort of, you know, creating very beautiful food. And then anything creative, and then anything in nature. So just being outside, you know, gardening, communing with nature, those things I feel like are replenishing. And I personally need a lot of time alone and a lot of silence. So if I'm in a really active writing stage, you know, like say I'm writing my first draft or something, for 6 months I won't socialize very much, and I won't talk even to my family very much. Like, you know, when there's a lot of conversation around the dinner table, I will be the quietest. I'm not silent, but I'm in my head a lot. And that's, you know, I think everybody sort of has their best way of working. I've also learned that it's best for me to write like very early in the morning, first thing in the morning. Other people are good late night writers. So, you know, I think you just have to find the formula that works for you, and then kind of know to go back to the things that fill you up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Shilpi, your most recent book has just been published in the US, is that right? Just come out, is that?
Yeah, it came out just as all of this joyousness was hitting the world. So The Shape of Family was published on March 17th. Yeah, in the US.
Wonderful. Well, great. Well, I know everybody will be eager to get a copy and read it. And you know, I highly recommend her other books as well. If you haven't had a chance yet, it'll be good stay-at-home reading for you all. Shilpi, we cannot thank you enough for spending time with us and helping us all learn something together. What a generous thing to do, and we really appreciate
my
you.
pleasure.
Yeah.
And good luck to everyone. One of the interesting things about this period is I can't wait to see what great new art comes out like a year or 2 years from now. You know, I think there are a lot more people who are making space for creativity in their lives. So I look forward to seeing what this family creates.